Welcome to the Free Cities podcast. My name is Timothy Allen, and this is the official podcast of the Free Cities Foundation. Hello and greetings from a decidedly autumnal rural Wales. This is episode number 45 of the Free Cities podcast, and today's episode is a conversation I had with two urban planners who designed a free city from scratch. Patrick Lamson-Hall and Nuria Forques are a husband and wife team whose firm Fitted Projects was commissioned to design the Honduran ZEDE community of Ciudad Morazán, which was the second ZEDE to be established in Honduras after Próspera. Now, whilst Próspera was focused mainly on technological innovation and connecting Honduras with international business, Morazán was designed more as a kind of blue-collar ZEDE, targeting working class and middle class residents, primarily from Honduras itself. Patrick and Nuria have a lot to say on the design, implementation and the future of free city projects, and it was really phenomenal to sit down with two people who have such an in-depth and hands-on experience of actually trying to manifest these innovative ideas in real life. This conversation was recorded during the New Cities and Network States weekend at Zuzalu, the so-called pop-up city gathering in Montenegro, and with many of the talks and presentations fresh in our minds, we ended up dissecting many of the projects within the Free Cities ecosystem and how the movement as a whole might best progress over the next few years. Don't forget, I say this every week, but I really mean it this time. It's now just 2 weeks until we all get to meet up in real life at Liberty in Our Lifetime. I can't wait to see you all there, and of course I have so many great podcast interviews lined up. If you can't make it to Prague, at least you can hear long-form discussions with all the top speakers right here on the Free Cities podcast. Look out for those over the next few months. And in the meantime, of course, you know what you have to do. Just sit back, relax, and enjoy my conversation with Patrick Lamson-Hall and Nuria Forques. I have actually spoken to one other city planner recently, who a former town planner, and this is a British guy. And but what I found interesting about what you're doing is, and correct me if I'm wrong, are you specifically in the Charter Cities, Free Cities space?
So we're specifically in the Charter City space, but not exclusively in the Charter City space. The first city that we designed from scratch was the Honduran ZEDE with Massimo, and obviously that's a Charter City project. So for us, that represented a leap forward for our business, because before that we'd primarily been focused on urban extensions, basically just growing cities. And, you know, in theory, we could design new cities of any ideological stripe, but in practice, it's the charter city and the free city people and the startup city people who are actually trying to do things on the ground.
So what's your connection with Morazán originally? How do you arrive in that world? And were you part of that world before?
Peripherally, I got interested in it through the refugee cities movement. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that.
So that sounds interesting, though. Let's hear about that one. The refugee cities. Refugee cities.
Exactly. This is Michael Castle-Miller, his work, and the basic idea is that most refugees end up in urban areas. You know, the vast majority, but there aren't necessarily cities that are accommodating to that. So the thinking is, like, rather than putting refugees in camps and that being the only place where they have any legitimacy, let's build cities where we would otherwise put refugee camps. So allow people to work, allow people to build buildings, allow people to have markets for labor and goods, and basically make it function in a more integrated way.
Yeah, basically what happens in refugee camps is that people go there, but they never get the stability long term because they can be kicked out at any point. So the idea with refugee cities is to give them that stability and that, that's
that possibility. So, all right, a couple of questions there that instantly spring to mind is, one, are these still hypothetical? And two, do you build them before they're needed, or do you build them as a result of them being needed?
Hypothetical, somewhat. There was an experiment, a long-term experiment that was run by a person named Kilian Kleinschmidt, who was actually in charge of a large refugee camp in Africa, where he started doing things like installing permanent infrastructure, allowing people to engage in trade and transactions, and essentially letting the place start to function more like a city. So there have been some cases where the UN itself, like where UNHCR, the High Commission for Refugees, actually allows that to start happening. As far as projects on the ground, no, there haven't been any. And you would do it in response to a crisis, but you would do it in a way that's very lightweight. Much of it is actually just about regulations, so you lay the place out, give people parcels of land, and then rather than restricting their activities, you allow their activities.
Interestingly, I've been to a lot of refugee camps. I was a journalist for many years, and I did work for NGOs quite a bit, and which took me to a lot of refugee camps. I have some very you might appreciate these stories actually, because they're not things I've ever spoken before. But I was sent a lot to places like Pakistan to sort of like cover particular things they were doing at refugee camps. And most of them were just disasters. I'll give you an example. So someone looked at it was just after the floods in Pakistan, and there were these huge camps. UNHCR had put up tents like they do. They're just like a sea of tents. And someone back in the UK from an NGO, I won't mention who they are, decided that it was a bad idea that first thing in the morning everyone was going out to the desert to go to the toilet, and they thought that's unclean kind of thing. That's not a good idea. So they came up with this idea of creating these kind of portaloo type things that could be set up easily, etc. Sure enough, pumped a bunch of money into it, put them into the middle of the refugee camp. Within a day, they were completely, they were a disaster. No one wanted to go anywhere near them. And of course, everyone carried on just going out to the outside world. And it was a class. I've seen that so many times in NGOs going, good, this would work. And they didn't provide anyone to clean them. No one wanted to clean them.
Right. It's mechanistic thinking. So they see that people don't have toilets, and they think the problem is that they don't have toilets. And they don't understand that there's an ecosystem that allows that to exist, and that has to be considered. And you see it a lot. I was visiting a camp in Uganda last year, and they had gone to a lot of trouble to install some really, really, really nice water equipment, kind of solar-powered pumps and treatment facilities, and it was well-built and well-placed and well taken care of. And somebody spent $1.50 and bought a padlock and slapped a lock on the pump, and suddenly they're a business person. And anyone who wants to use that water has to pay them for it.
That's happened to me in Kenya as well. Exactly the same thing has happened. People privatized these water sources that were put in by NGOs. Yeah, I suppose this kind of stuff's at the heart of your business, isn't it? Like working out what you're supposed to do in these kind of environments, in cities, in towns, in refugee camps or whatever. And here's my big question about this, because when I look at new settlements, let's say, let's talk about those kind of things, not adding on to sort of, existing ones. My preference would always be to see that settlement arise organically, rather than the idea that somebody somewhere can create this model, implement it, and it work. Because personally, I've never felt the models work. I mean, the classic example is, when you go to any city, the first question is, where's the old part of town? Everyone wants to go to the old part of town. It's got all businesses which rose organically. It's got little, it's got an organic feeling to it because it arose with demand. So how do you approach that? as a kind of designer of cities, let's say?
Well, I guess like the examples that you're talking about would, like, we could take the examples of European cities. When you go to the center, it's medieval and so on. But many times we forget that under that medieval structure, there was actually a planned city before. Like, I come from Valencia in Spain, and there you can actually walk. There's a museum, like an archaeological museum that's in the center, where you can actually see where the original Roman streets were, and some of the existing streets currently are still following that pattern. So the cities went through the dark ages, right? They got all twisty and charming as per our current standards, but they were planned in the original way.
Yeah, and I think that illustrates something, which is that like there are some decisions that are condition-setting decisions. And then there are other decisions that can occur more organically. So if you don't take the time to organize the basic framework of the city in the beginning, you end up with a lot of missing public goods. Specifically, you end up with an insufficient amount of land in non-revenue generating uses, because private sector actors can certainly organize a city. You know, they can make it occur, but they're going to really, really allocate as much land as possible to revenue generating uses. So non-excludable public goods like streets and roads end up diminished, and you end up in a low equilibrium. So the role of planning, properly done, the way that we try to do it, is to say, okay, what do you actually need to establish as a public good in the beginning? Like, what's the actual role of the public sector in urbanization? And then what do you not need to do anything with? And in my opinion, and I think probably we share this opinion, the public sector has to set up the network of public goods and then kind of leave it alone and let things happen. And that's how you end up with these charming places, because they have a framework, and then they have an accumulation of millions of individual decisions that happen in the private space and create something really unpredictable and dynamic.
Can you talk a little bit about the process of designing Morazán then? How did that start, middle, and end?
Massimo didn't want to do that, so we tried repeatedly to convince Massimo to let the development process be more organic, but he has a real ideological preference for the entrecom model, which is like running a city kind of like it's like you're a mall operator, so you control all the spaces. You're basically giving people leases, and you never sell any land. So in that situation, and you build and own the buildings. So in the plans that we typically would support, the developer wouldn't build and own any buildings. They're just doing subdivision of land. And the reason for that is because that's what lets this interesting stuff happen in the private space. Mm-hmm. But on Morazán, so we started with the site. We started by going on the ground, seeing what the site was like, getting information on its boundaries, its topography, what you might actually be able to build there. And then we did market studies. So we studied the population distribution in the area, visited a bunch of different housing units all up and down the economic ladder so that we could see what the current market offerings were, and started to identify where there might be a niche.
And we also did environmental studies because the site was close to a river that floods often. So we wanted to make sure that we were able to incorporate the right infrastructure to avoid constant flooding of the area.
Yeah. And once we had that background information, we were able to think about how can we subdivide this land? How can we put in place road axes that will allow people to easily get to work, considering the distribution of employers in the area? How can we create neighborhoods that will feel safe and welcoming? This is all about just laying the land out. And then in the end, Massimo also wanted us to design the buildings. So the challenge that we had there was, how do you make a big improvement on the current market offerings, which in Honduras are frankly quite terrible in the low end of the market, without busting your price point? So the way that the Honduran ZEDE is sometimes described as a gated community for low-income people, in the sense that it has good security, it has 24-hour running water and electricity, It has houses that are comfortable to live in and public spaces. Okay, this is great and sounds really nice. But if you want to actually be in the market there, you have to deliver all that at the same price people are paying in the communities that they're living in now. So this is where Nuria was really able to innovate on the existing designs.
And so we did design the buildings based on that to try to offer competitive price in the area of Morazán, but at a better quality. But that also, that was like the mathematical exercise on how we offered better conditions at a competitive price. And with that, because all the investment was coming from the same actor, from Massimo, we also did that exercise with the urban infrastructure. So that's where we really try to reduce the amount of, like, to find equilibrium between the amount of public land versus the land that was actually going to generate the profit, and how we were able to say, okay, so these will be probably the priority routes where people will be. There will be commercial spaces, we'll have bigger buildings here. In the neighborhoods, people usually don't own a car in Honduras, because especially if it's a lower income community. So those streets can be narrower because they don't need to allocate that much space for cars. And therefore we get more land for the private space. And that's kind of how was like a lot of back and forth trying to figure out the best solution for that.
That's right. So a lot of how we got that profitability was by using design strategies that maximize the amount of land that was leasable. So we got them to try townhouses, which they don't typically do in Honduras. Townhouse just means that you're sharing a wall with your neighbor. But if the construction quality is really, really bad, which it usually is there, you don't want to share a wall with your neighbor. So because we were designing the buildings, we had the ability to bring in better standards for materials. We could pay for it because you didn't have to put a bunch of empty land around every house. Then, reducing the share of land in streets not only created communities that were more walkable, it meant that there was more leasable land on the site. So the relative share of infrastructure cost in the cost of every unit was lower. So in the end, we were able to produce something that was really competitive. And, for us, it was exciting because in theory, if you have that flexibility, like if you have the control to set your own standards when it comes to street width and plot coverage and building height, you could do that anywhere in Latin America. A private sector developer could be stamping out communities that would be mixed use, dense, integrated, high quality for people who are in like the middle and bottom quintile of the income distribution. So we're really hoping to see more projects like that, because once you take away all the regulatory constraints, then it just becomes a matter of doing the math and then coming up with a design that fits that math, which is totally possible.
Yeah.
So, sorry, what was the regulatory framework that you had to work under?
we wrote them.
You did. You got to write it
because
yourself.
It's a ZEDE. So the
zoning part,
basically. We wrote
the
urban development code. I don't know how much of it Massimo kept in the end, but we wrote the urban development code around these ideas of flexibility of uses, these ideas of density. But when I say density, I don't mean height. I mean allowing people to live close together so that you can really optimize the use of land. And because it was a ZEDE, we were able to do that with almost no interference or oversight. We could just do it on the basis of what we consider to be best practices. Then those rules get submitted and approved. The Committee on Best Practices that oversees the ZEDEs, honestly, I don't think they care about land use rules at all. So my impression is that it flies right through, which was amazing and very unique.
And did you come across any particular obstacles at all, or did you get to basically envisage your own plan and put it into practice without having to curb too much?
We had to respond to Massimo's constraints, and it was his project, so we had a lot of meetings with him, making sure that it worked with what he needed. And like he had the idea of the development of the site as a city, but also like had some constraints in how much industrial land he wanted to have on site, like what type of schools he wanted, and he wanted like a commercial strip that could be accommodating. Also like businesses or people who would be coming there for tax purposes, buying things, but then living outside. So there were those different elements that we were integrating in the design and like discussing with Massimo over time to see how to make them all fit together.
But the main thing that the main constraint that we encountered is something that honestly I think most planners of new communities just ignore completely, which is the market conditions. Because we were targeting the kinds of people who would work in the factories, that meant that we had a much lower envelope for what we could get done overall. And I think part of why we're really proud of that project is in the end, we delivered something that's better than the communities that are targeting higher income people there. And it's just a testament to what you can get done when you really get to focus just on the nuts and bolts.
And do you think that the regulation in the outside world, let's call it, has something to do with the fact that you managed to deliver something better at a lower cost?
That, yes, but also, that's a lot of it. So someone who's doing a formal sector development outside of a ZEDE in Honduras is just buried in red tape. It's very expensive. The projects that are formal sector built there, I doubt that they sell to anyone below the 20th percent, or the 80th percentile in income. I doubt that they sell to anyone who makes less than that. Because in the end, it amounts to a lot. It's little costs, death by 1,000 cuts. So say the difference between your road being by regulation 12 meters wide versus 5 meters wide means the difference between having 70% of your site leasable and 50%.
Right.
And it's a small thing, and there are a lot of things like that, and they add up to this massive difference in the profitability per unit, which just pushes the price point up and up and up. So I think that's really, and I'm not anti-regulation necessarily, but often what happens in low-income countries is they write regulations that make it impossible for low-income people or even the average person to live in a unit that was built legally. And we see that in all over Latin America and Africa. So we really got an opportunity to sidestep that.
So how often have you been going to and from since completion?
We haven't been.
You haven't been? Okay.
Not since then.
The only reason I'm asking is I'm interested. I'm wondering, with the benefit of hindsight now, are you noticing how you would improve next time, given the same task? Are there things you thought, because I know what what this kind of world must be like. You can always improve. And once real life individuals start sort of like walking around the streets and all those great, I have very limited experience of this, but I did build a building myself in the UK.
Amazing.
But it came from me sketching something on a piece of paper. We didn't even get an architect to design it in the end. And I got most things right, but there's a few things like if I come down the stairs, you got to mind your head at one point, and I was like, damn, So what about when you're designing a whole town then?
Yeah. Just as an aside, as an architect, that happens to architects too. So
yes, I know. Yeah. Which is why we were building a very simple design. So I thought, may as well just save ourselves a bunch of money.
It's the worst that could happen.
Yeah, exactly.
To me, I would say it's like, yes, there's always things. And when you see or at least for me, when you see your past work, you would improve and change and adjust. And I think to me, that's like a good sign, because it means that my ideas have evolved and the way that I see the work has evolved, and that I see improvements that could be done. And I try to think of those and apply them to the future projects. So every time that we have a new project, we learn things from it. Especially because we're exposed to more contexts and more different spaces. So you end up always learning things and then trying to apply those learnings to whatever comes next.
One thing that we've come up with since then, that we started it, we got like the kernel of the idea in this project, but it's really come to fruition in our more recent projects, is how we handle pedestrian streets. So we started with this idea of having some basically some houses that open onto streets that are pedestrian only. And since then, our thinking has evolved to see that as something that's pretty desirable as a backbone network in the city as a whole. And the expectation there is that some people will prefer to live on a street like that because they're worried about their kids getting hit by a car. Other people will prefer to live on a street like that because they think it has good potential to open a business. Some of them will develop as quiet residential streets. Others will develop as bustling commercial streets like you see in the centers of European cities. So this is an idea that I think we started it in that project, and it's really come into its own in the last few projects.
Yeah, I would say to that, it's not necessarily pedestrian streets, but non-motorized streets, so people can bike safely without having cars around, or can move around by walking.
There's definitely a cultural component to that as well, because the early evening promenade is a big deal in a lot of places, and people love to sit outside their house at that time, don't they?
They do.
I'm a big fan of that time of the day in certain countries. We don't have it where I live, unfortunately, but
that's true. That's true. And I also think it's something that you don't want to overdo. I mean, there's a lot of push in planning right now to be anti-car or car-free. And to me, I think we should be mode agnostic for a lot of things. But it's definitely the case that you create a different type of space by setting expectations for how people move around. So when we put those pedestrian streets in, they're never more than half a block away from a street that has a car, but we design it in a way that they feel completely separate. So you're not actually inconvenienced. For instance, for someone who has a disability or someone who's elderly, it's very accessible, but you still get that nice intangible benefit of being separated from that.
Yeah, I suppose that the downside of, like you say, is bringing the shopping home or whatever, if you can't stop outside your house.
So what we've evolved from Morazán into these new designs, that we make them a width that would accommodate some type of motorized transportation if an emergency comes to place. So a fire truck or an ambulance can come in, or a delivery service that's bringing the new bathtub that you bought, right? So we allow some flexibility on that, but in general they would have either bollards or some type of passive infrastructure that dissuades cars from going into those streets.
Yeah, interestingly, and this is something I think have learned from looking at European cities, the pedestrianized spaces become more functional, not less functional, when you design them in a way where they can occasionally accommodate vehicles.
Is that right?
Yeah, sure, because you want people to actually live there who have actual jobs, right? I mean, they're not supposed to be sort of just these dead streets. So if you want to have someone living there who's got a wholesale hardware store, you have to be able to get a delivery vehicle in.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it doesn't really work.
What's your preferred model then? Would it be, I mean, let's talk zoning, because people in my world hate the term zoning. It's all zoning always gets it wrong. It always allocates capital in the wrong places. Are you in agreement there, or do you think there's some merit in it?
Well, look, it's not that. I mean, this is another area where our thinking is in the process of evolving. But zoning does a ton of harm. Obviously, totally agree. It generates deadweight loss left, right, and center, and it makes it so that, upper middle class professionals like ourselves can't afford to live in Manhattan, even though we really would have liked to. It causes problems like that. But one way that our thinking has evolved on it is when you're starting a new city. So in an existing city, I don't really see a role for zoning. I think markets and nuisance regulations do everything that you would want to get out of zoning much more cheaply and efficiently. In a new city, you've got a problem, which is that if you're not building any buildings like we advocate for, the market formation process, the land market formation process, can be unstructured in a way that results in a low equilibrium. So say that we lay out a street that would make a great high street, but the first tenant that shows up there really just wants to take advantage of the fact that it's rather wide, and they set up a car garage, a repair garage for cars. And that basically discourages higher end tenants from coming in and occupying that space, like from occupying the spaces on that street, and you can end up in a lower equilibrium. So the way that we've been thinking about zoning lately is as something that has a market forming function in the early days of a new city. Then you write it so that it sunsets. So you write your zoning code and you say, look, we think our best guess is that this is going to be a high street. So we're going to zone it in a way that encourages that kind of use. You do it using nuisance-based regulations. So you do it using noise regulations. You do it using facade regulations. You don't actually say this has to be Louis Vuitton. And then you write it so that if you're wrong, after 10 years it sunsets and the street becomes whatever. Or after 5 years it sunsets and the street becomes whatever. So early market forming functions, that's what we want from it. Yeah. And the rest of it you do with nuisance regulations.
And I would add to that, like the nuisance regulations and whatever other types of regulations that you end up implementing need to be flexible and evolve over time. You cannot you write them one day and then they become a dogma, because I think that's what happens in many of these places that become very stagnant because those regulations never get questioned again. So you want to make sure that there's some type of recycling of regulations that adapts or evolves with the city itself.
But it should be easy. Like the nuisance regulations should be easy to measure. So we were writing some regulations recently, and we were thinking a lot about like noise, decibels. It's a major consideration for people. And we were thinking, okay, we're going to write it so that we have a designation that's like a quiet neighborhood where the max decibels that you can hear when you're 5 meters from the facade of the building is 45. That's the most. But you can do whatever you want in that building as long as you meet that regulation. So if you decide that you want to have, I don't know, a factory in there, say a hammer factory, something that's just as loud as can be, as long as you want to put in the soundproofing, knock yourself out, go to town. But if on that street you're seeing a lot of people putting in hammer factories, okay, maybe you should change the zoning, because if it's developing in that way, if there's a market demand for that there, no reason to keep it to 45. Might as well let it be what it's going to be. But the nice thing about it is with technology, in general, I think smart cities are a total scam. But one place where I do see potential for them is in technology to monitor nuisances. So when it comes to something like a 45 decibel neighborhood, you can actually just put a device that measures it, and, a directional microphone at the users. And if you see that they're consistently exceeding the standard, if you wanted to be really ambitious about it, you could even have a ticket written automatically. Maybe they can petition it, but the potential's there for that.
Yeah. This is an assumption. Correct me if I'm wrong. When in days of old, when cities evolved, did they follow a similar pathway to the point where we find, the way that in the existence of them, when they reach some kind of, not fully formed, but when they become formed? You said that a lot of these cities go back to a point where they were planned. But, I'm thinking something like, a village appears on a river, which is a useful place. Mm-hmm. 300 years later, it's a big settlement. What happens in those kind of places naturally? Does the market create a functioning city, or do people always come in and sort of try and dictate what should be where?
It's a good question. So the market creates a city that has a lot of inefficiencies because of this shortage of public goods. London is a great example. This is a place that it's been agreed for a long time would benefit from rationalization of its layout and street network and there have been efforts to do it, and they've been very costly, because the organic evolutionary pattern failed to account for a lot of necessities. So what often ends up happening is you have the existing city, which is like kind of small, and then at some point somebody gets a wild hair and plans a new area, and the high value uses relocate to the new area, and the population growth accrues in the new area. And then the old area is kind of abandoned for a while. Then people come along and refurbish it, and it becomes very charming. That's the trajectory that's been seen in a lot of cities that happened organically. Now, the reason why that's possible and why it makes any sense at all is because cities grew very slowly for a long time, and then they grew very fast. So the older part of the city, like Barcelona is a good example. The old part of Barcelona is 1/9 of the total city area. So you can actually say, look, we're going to make an extension here. We made an extension in the 1850s, the Ciudad plan, and it's going to be rational and modern and orderly and have everything that we want. And this cute little old part is going to be the cute little old part. Now, where you get in trouble is when the rate of growth is super, super fast. So the cute little old part isn't 1/9, it's half. And then you really just have a dysfunctional environment that needs retrofitting and upgrades. Yeah, and
then like an example of those retrofitting upgrades we can see in Paris, with like the whole area kind of grew up in that original more informal pattern. And then at some point, Haussmann came and started to open avenues left and right to be able to make the city more functional in some capacity.
And it was super expensive.
Yeah.
Super expensive to do it. In most places, it doesn't really happen practically.
And it produces displacement and really alters the local economy and so on and so forth.
See, the problem is it's very hard to get private sector entities to coordinate to provide network goods. So like the arterial road network in a city is a great example of a network good, where the main thing that it does is it provides connectivity throughout the labor market. It's a network that's designed to carry you from one side of the city to the other. There's no real incentive from any actor to build a road like that. Even to be able to assemble the land for a road like that is challenging. So in practice, if you don't have some coordinating entity that makes that occur, it doesn't get built. Versus small neighborhood roads always get built. The private sector can do that just fine. You don't have to touch it because the private sector is very well incentivized to build those roads. Those are what make their land valuable. They give access to the plots.
Right.
So there's a scale thing.
Yeah. So what's the ideal methodology then? Take your in your mind's eye, if you were to design a new place. I'm not even going to say a city. I'm going to say a place, because I think, it's arguable how many people want to live in cities, actually. I know a lot of people come there because they're a good use of resources, aren't they?
I believe in revealed preferences.
What does that mean?
It means that if 60% of humanity lives in cities, regardless of what people say, they like cities.
Right. What about the other 40%?
They're moving. No, in all seriousness, in most places, the urban share of the population stabilizes somewhere between 70 and 80%. So there's a process of urbanization that initializes at a certain point. People move from rural areas to cities. The cities grow. And eventually the share of the population in urban areas stabilizes at between 70 and 80%.
That's interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Is that across cultures?
Yes, so far. There haven't been any exceptions to that.
Because the reason I ask, I'm watching that happen now in Mongolia, somewhere I've been going for many years. Used to be, when I first started going there, I think it was 48% nomadic people, 52 in the cities. It's now 35. I was wondering when it might stabilize, because it's a vast country with so much space. Space. It's the size of Western Europe with the population of 3 million, I think, or something. It's absolutely astonishing. And everyone's coming to the main cities still with all that space. So
yeah, my aunt says those places, it's acres and acres of acres and acres.
It's the least densely populated country in the world, actually, Mongolia.
Yeah. I think it holds across cultures. I really do. The other interesting thing that seems to hold across cultures is roughly equal numbers of people settled in small cities, medium-sized cities, large cities, and very large cities. So you would think globally that everyone kind of ends up in megacities or will eventually, but it's not true. The share of the population living in the largest cities has been pretty stable. So in the end, it's an expression of preferences, but the preferences tend for most people to tilt against against rural living.
Something that's just sprung to my mind, this is a complete tangent, but did you see recently, somewhere in the Middle East, someone had designed this very long...
Neom?
Is that what it's called?
Aware of that one, yes.
What do you think of that? I mean, maybe explain what it is first for anyone that doesn't know, and then tell me what you think of it. Because that's a really unusual plan, isn't it?
I'll explain what it is, and then Nuria can tell what we think of it, if that's all right. So sure. What it is it's a scheme by Saudi Arabia to create a linear city. And it's a linear city that is oriented around a high-speed transportation network, basically train lines. How do they put it? They describe it as like a skyscraper turned on its side.
Yeah.
And the question of why they're doing this, I frankly am not sure. It's got some logic to it, which is about creating an enclave where Western values can create a business climate that's more favorable, and it will do development in that part of the country. And some people say that it's meant to be like a pyramid in terms of its longevity, you know, almost like a permanent type.
But it isn't
structure.
just a very long, thin.
It is a long
strip of
a long, thin strip of high-rise buildings.
How long is it? Like,
I think it's pretty long.
It's
like
kilometers.
100 kilometers is the idea, something like that.
And not that wide, but from above, it would look like a
line.
A line.
They call
basically.
it a line.
And it even does it even fit in with the landscape in some shape or form? I mean, it's going through the desert, right?
They're trying to manipulate the landscape with it. So it's supposed to be high enough that it casts a shadow that creates a microclimate. And they have activities occurring in the microclimate. And then in between it's actually two buildings running down through the desert, or say like a building that's shaped like a U. So in the center of that, it's also supposed to have a microclimate that's cooler and more humid.
But does it have a roof over the top of it?
Doesn't have a roof.
So,
no.
Right, okay. So
it doesn't rain there anyways.
I know, but the sun, I'm thinking of like something to shade the sun.
I mean, the buildings themselves provide the shading.
What about when the sun's overhead, though?
Look, there's a lot of problems with this idea. Okay. Between you and me, the sun is the least of the problems with this idea.
Well, come on then. So what do you think of it? Like I say, nothing to do with what we were talking about.
I
just saw it and I thought, well, interesting concept. But the other thing I thought was, my brain doesn't work like that. My brain doesn't just want to go from here to there. My brain wants to go outwards from the middle. Do you know what I mean? Like that, I want to explore out in a circle, not in a straight line. I don't know.
What do you think, Nuria? What do you think of it?
Okay, so what I think is like it's a big building. It's not a city. So they're doing a building that has these ideals and these things and how they want it to work. But in the end, it's gonna, I don't know, I kind of imagine it a bit like the Titanic in the sense that like the rich live on top and the poor, I don't know where they're gonna be allocating them. Maybe wherever it's hotter in the building, or maybe the poor end up building slums next to it. That could be the thing. Like, I don't know where their economic understanding of this structure is. Also, as you were saying, like the way to move around, it's like you are dependent on this single thing that goes back and forth. So how many stops is that gonna have? Obviously, where those stops are will be where the more activity is, what happens in between. And if you live in between, what do you get from living there versus, I don't know, somewhere else that's not in the building?
That's a good
cheaper housing, probably.
Yeah, exactly.
Why would you live there is a question that I think they've not answered.
Yeah.
And another question that they haven't answered is, because it's all one building, what kinds of spaces can you actually create? Because not all economic activities can take place in what's essentially office space. You know, it just isn't workable in that regard.
Where's their hammer factory?
Where's their hammer factory? Where's their barber shop? You know, where's the guy who shines your shoes or sells you dates or whatever? I don't see any acknowledgement on their part that the economy is more complex than the white collar sector.
Yeah.
And the immediately adjacent services that they demand. So in that sense, to me, it seems like a big boondoggle.
Okay. Come on then. Let's go back to the other question I had, which was, how do you do it best? Let's say a new ZEDE appears, a new ZEDE gets granted, and it's a free market ZEDE. It's one where you're going to be selling individual plots and et cetera, et cetera. How do you go about that from the ground up?
First of all, you need to understand what the demand is there, right? Like, who is going to be coming there? What do they want? And where are they coming from? And I think, and for how long? Like, how many people are we going to be able to accommodate in there? So I think without that, you cannot really have the tools to understand what you can do. Then we do some demographic studies, population studies, the same environment.
Let me interrupt you. Maybe this is one you can take from the top. I think a lot of it's about like what the goal is, like thinking of it in those terms.
Yeah.
So like to me, the goal is functional metropolitan labor market, inclusivity of the local population, and land, like access to land. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm sitting in on a meeting now.
Well,
let's design a city.
Because it's like, what do we do practically? Like, you're right. Like, what we do practically is we do a bunch of studies. But the reason why we do that, I think, is because we want to create a place that actually responds to the market conditions.
Okay, then, this is something that I've been listening to people talk about a fair bit at where we are now in Montenegro. And that is that there are different reasons why free cities start. And I like this idea that there are sort of online communities. Then there are online communities that want to manifest in real life. Then there are people designing cities from scratch without even probably thinking about a community until they've kind of created it, and all these different ways. And I've settled my mind has settled upon the idea that it's quite important to have a common goal amongst the community. Otherwise, you run the risk of places like where we are now, which are I'm not a great fan of places like this because they're full in the summer. And in the winter, probably there's no one here, or you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You need a reason to bring people to stay in a community. I'll tell you why, because before we came here, we visited Montenegro, which, do you know what Montenegro is?
No.
Right. Just south of here, there's a sort of Russian expat community of about 300 people.
Yeah.
And they're very much a libertarian community. So that's the glue that binds them together. And they've bought some land and they've started building now, and they're selling the plots, and that's what's keeping them there. That people are coming now. So other Russians are coming because they want to be there. And as a result, they've now got a little community hub where everyone comes, and there's people doing business, and there's, you know what I mean?
Yeah, but it's not good to say the Russians are coming. Some people might panic. I think, and Nuria, I really want you to talk about what we actually do, but I think that relies on no offense, of course. I think that relies on like a flawed understanding of what the actual community is. So it's perfectly nice to have a bunch of people get together around a shared value system, but inevitably they're engaging with a wider group than just that shared value system. They're engaging with the people who are cleaning their rooms. They're engaging with the people who are fixing their cars, who are selling them potatoes, I assume. They're engaging with a spectrum of people. Most of the people who are actually interacting with their community don't share their ideology at all. So I'm perfectly in favor of having a core group of founders who share a vision. Where I start to struggle is when they understand their community to consist only of themselves. It's very narrow. So I would say people who have that idea of what a community is aren't actually interested in building cities. What they're interested in doing is building neighborhoods that are adjacent to other functioning economies that are value neutral. The approach that we take to planning is like it's about the problem you want to solve. The approach that we take to planning is that there are a lot of people who are moving to cities. They need to be housed. They need land where they can meet their other needs: commercial, government, public space, residential. And some of them are going to form into functioning and coherent communities, and others are going to form into communities that are united around the thing that most communities are united around, which is a desire to trade and a desire to have their families grow up well. And that's how most communities are going to look. Mm-hmm. Ideological communities are super interesting. And I do believe that there's a role for a vanguard. Like the founding culture of a city is very important, but I don't think that it's necessary to be values aligned with 95% of the people in your city.
Yeah, and I feel like also like communities that share a set of values, like it's like an old idea in a way. Like there's always been neighborhoods where the rich people live and where like the noblemen live, or where this happens, and then next to them there's always other neighborhoods where the people who service those neighborhoods actually live in. And you've got lots of gated communities around the world, and like even in, say, in San Francisco, where like in theory it's a city where everyone can live everywhere, there's these enclaves of people who have really beautiful mansions and big yards, and then there's neighborhoods further from where the land is expensive, where the people actually live, and they have to commute to clean their houses. So there's always like, yeah, that's a community on their own, like this rich neighborhood, but it's not an isolated community. There's more to it.
There's nothing wrong with that. No. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having an enclave of people. Where I start to struggle with it is when they talk about themselves as being a city, mm-hmm. because they're not. You know, they're ignoring the other parts of it that actually make the place work.
What's your view then on the network state idea itself? Are you fans or not?
I don't know that much about it, to be honest.
Myself, not either. Let's break it down to what I think it is then, and tell me what you think about that, which is basically a bit like the way to start a new city is first to establish your community, your users.
Yeah.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
So the network state idea is, let's make a network of people who commit to this thing.
Yeah.
And then we build it, rather than let's build something and hope that the people come to us, I suppose.
Yeah. I mean, obviously we have,
that might be wrong, by the way.
No,
well.
but
that might be the concept.
But I haven't heard anybody talking about having their house cleaner join the network state.
Right.
You know, so in that sense, you've nailed it. Where I think there is some validity to it, which I was just thinking of recently, is this that I was saying before. Mm-hmm. So right now, the legitimate participants in the international system are nation states, sovereign nation states. And this has been the case since Westphalia, basically. There are efforts underway for other actors to participate in the nation state system. For example, there's an organization called United Cities and Local Governments that's attempting to bring urban governance levels, subnational governance levels to the table in conversations, you know, and as fully vested actors in conversations about topics of mutual interest, like global warming, for instance. And I consider this to be a very legitimate effort, because these are real actors who have real decision-making power and also are impacted by the decisions. So it doesn't seem crazy to me to imagine a world where other constituencies are also included. For instance, non-geographic constituencies like the network state could potentially be included in this international system. But I think that where I maybe differ from the network state idea, you know, so you could imagine a situation where all the people who are committed to longevity research or interstellar spaceflight research are able to come to the table and participate in the international system. That I could see, and I could actually see that as being useful in a way, kind of a logical evolution of the nation state system, where I think maybe I differ from the network state idea is I think that this has to be based on peer relationships between these entities. You know, the nation state notion, the notion of sovereignty, is that Montenegro has exactly the same status in the international system as the United States or China. And I think the nation state is unique in that because it creates a level playing field for topics of mutual importance. Where the network state seems to want to differentiate themselves is they want to be outside the rules of that system and not engage as peers because they see it as in some way restrictive. And to me, I think that like creating a parallel system adjacent to the nation state system, to me seems a little bit short-sighted. I think it could create a scenario where it's very difficult to coordinate.
I think, yeah, and I hear what you're saying. I suppose the flip side of that argument is we can't create what we want within the current regime, so we need to create a parallel system.
But in my opinion, I think this is very lazy. So Balaji actually said during it's Balaji, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Balaji actually said during his talk over here that the entire nation state system as it exists today, the institutions of fiat currency, the idea of large standing armies, international organizations like the UN, these all came out of the post-World War I attempt to create a more stable order, and were really formed up in the post-World War II, institution building time. And my takeaway from that is, in contradiction to what the network state people are saying, existing states are incredibly dynamic and adaptive. They created the entire world order that we have today almost from scratch in a very short period of time under very difficult conditions, and it's proved to be quite stable. I don't necessarily buy the argument that nation states aren't capable of adapting. I think that the record shows that they are. And so it feels to me a little bit like an evasion to say, oh, we can't do it within the existing framework. I think what they're really saying is we can't do it that fast.
Okay.
To me, my objections to it, I think, are way more basic, which is that in the end, we have bodies that are physical, that occupy space, and that space is already allocated within the boundaries of a jurisdiction, right? So if we are physically in that space, we need to participate one way or another from that jurisdiction. You can create your own physical space, say like a new country or whatever, your new ZEDE, and change part of those circumstances, right? So you can adjust your regulations, you can adjust your whatever you don't like. But once you go across the border of your space and you have to engage with other people, you will need to figure out how to engage with these other people with their own rules as well, right? So you cannot impose your own beliefs into others because they have their own set of their own systems. So to me, that's the thing. Like in the end, we're physical and we live in a world that's physical. And so we need to engage with that reality.
I suppose once again that one of the main arguments is that currently the ability to opt out or opt into some other system is somewhat limited. And by that, I mean, there are no frontiers anymore. If you don't...
There never really were.
Well,
to be fair.
To be fair, yes. But very much now, technology has cemented the infrastructure of the world to mean there are no frontiers other than space and deep sea and right out at sea, let's say 100, what is it? Outside the 200-mile exclusion zone. These are the frontiers. Other than space, of course, and there's no question that space will be a phenomenal frontier at some point.
Space actually already has a governance structure.
Yeah, the UN agreement.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, which is a bit, I mean, I have an issue with that because that basically says, look, where you can't claim anywhere, But like, if I was Elon Musk and I had a private company and I pumped all that money into going to Mars, I'm not about to listen to the UN and go, right.
No, in the end, it's a framework for a simpler time, let's say.
Yeah.
The reason why you need a frontier hasn't been fully demonstrated to me, frankly. I think that what the frontier temporarily allowed people to do was ignore the considerations of existing entities. And I think that the myth of the frontier was that it was a tabula rasa. But in truth, speaking as someone from the US, they were essentially running roughshod over the people and institutions that were there when they arrived. So the way that frontiers have existed in the past is essentially as a power differential. If you have enough power compared to the people and institutions that are already there, then surely you can treat it like those people and institutions don't exist. Maybe we should be nervous about a bunch of billionaires trying to set one up in a country like Montenegro, for example, because it's not entirely dissimilar. Their model's not entirely dissimilar. I think what's harder, and what I think they're trying to not avoid maybe, but evade, is the work of coexisting. Really coexisting, including with people who don't share your values, and recognizing that when you decide to do something ambitious, like extend the human lifespan, this is maybe a decision that shouldn't be taken completely in isolation. And if there are obstacles to doing so that require you to persuade people, maybe that should be taken as a necessary step in the process, I would say.
I agree with that. And I think it is in the case of are you talking about the life?
The longevity people.
The longevity people, yeah. I mean, I probably shouldn't talk about that because I don't know enough about it. But I do know that like you've discovered, you can create your own legislation within to a point. Mm-hmm. So there is a committee that decides whether that regulation is okay or not. And I think in the case of, say, Próspera, that is picking and choosing from other regulations you already find around the world in certain countries. But I think I'd like to talk about that. But just be me making it up as I go along. So
can I say a bit about the exit piece?
Yeah,
Vitalik persuaded me yesterday about the need for an exit option, but he didn't convince me that there was a need for an exit option for tech millionaires and billionaires.
Okay.
His basic argument, which I found very persuasive, was that there are people who technically have the right to leave the nation state that they're in right now, but practically speaking, have nowhere that they can go that they would want to be. So providing those people with a low-cost, very accessible exit option can be a very good thing in their lives. He was speaking specifically about people that he knows in Russia who are finding themselves really constrained as they're trying to get away from the Putin regime. But I would probably say that the same thing exists in a lot of African countries and Latin American countries. So I see a role for exit, but I don't necessarily see the need for it amongst the people who are advocating for it, if you know what I mean.
Maybe it's because they feel that they might have the opportunity to actually see these projects through.
Possibly,
I don't think there's anything wrong with being ideologically believing in that notion.
No, surely not.
But because I think in the case of, I mean, I can't speak for Vitalik, I don't really know him, but I would imagine, I know he loosely speaking comes from the world of libertarianism, and it would make sense to him that the ability to self-govern is important. I'm assuming.
I would guess, yeah.
Right, which would be my stance as well. I think I would love to see the ability to opt in and out of society's governance models, which currently we don't really have that option. We have the democratic system, which disenfranchises normally most people when even if there's it depends how many people are voting to begin with, which is normally not a lot, and then within that you disenfranchise probably half the people, and then who knows if the people that the promises they gave you they're actually going to do so,
true.
But who knows? I mean, but presumably though, overall you're optimistic and happy that these questions are being asked now.
Definitely. Governance experimentation is obviously important, and sandboxes are obviously important. And the questions that they're asking as a community are good questions. I would rather see them asked in a context of engagement rather than in a context of distancing.
Okay. So, right. Okay. That's interesting. Do you also find that at this stage we're dealing with a lot of ideas and not a lot of concrete, and I don't mean actual concrete, not a lot of concrete examples of what people are thinking about? I mean, is that a necessary part of the process?
Seems that way. I guess it is.
But you're in the business of actually making these things, so
we are.
You could argue, well, hey, you don't have to just have ideas; you can actually do them. So,
yeah, you can actually do them, kinda. So the ideas have to be actionable for you to actually do them. That's what's great about the Morazán project or the Próspera project, for example. These are people who managed to translate their ideas into a form where you could make it happen on the ground. And what I see in a lot of these projects is that there's not a clear bridge between the idea set or the preference set and the reality. And
can you explain that? I'm not sure I understand what that means.
Sure. So for instance, the Praxis people who are wanting to establish an online community initially and then establish a real city somewhere on the Mediterranean coast. It sounds good. It sounds fine. But when you look at their plans, they have a really clear and effective strategy for how to do the first thing. And they haven't even started to really engage with how to do the second thing.
First thing being get the community.
Second thing, build the city. So this would seem kind of normal, except for the fact that they require totally different skill sets. And there's no reason to do the first one if you can't do the second one. So I think, and by the way, they're relatively advanced compared to a lot of projects. So I think that in the end, the tendency of technologists to ignore the details is going to make it very difficult to make these things happen on the ground.
Yeah, because I think like the digital world is a world that evolves very quick and it's very easy to act on, right? So you can come up with a code, you write it in the moment, and 5 minutes later, or however long it takes, you have your app, right? But on the physical world, which is where we move on and where we develop our ideas, things take time. You need to engage a lot of different agents. Like you cannot come up with the idea of a city and next thing you know, the city is built. You need to find someone who can actually, go with a bulldozer and open the road, and then someone who can like lay down the asphalt or whatever, right? So it's like, it's a more complex process that involves a lot more people, that it happens through a longer period of time. And I think that happens every time you engage with some type of physicality. Like even if you come up with like this, and really speaking out of terms here, but like the genes therapies and so on, that you can have all the ideas in the head, and then how do you develop that into something that's actually gonna make your body last longer? Like I think they're working on it, and I think part of the beauty of some of these projects is that they really want to make these things happen. It's not just ideas, like they're really trying to figure out a path forward, and that's why they're coming up with these alternative jurisdiction or these alternative ways of trying to get there.
I must admit that this particular gathering of people here, it has shown me the different communities within this world, which I wasn't aware of before. I mean, I kind of was, but now I've seen it in real life. I'm putting it together, piecing the pieces together, and I understand where you're coming from. There's the tech, there's the online people, and then there's the real life people, and they're not really, they're being polite with each other at the moment, but they're not really working together as far as I can see. And they may not ever work together, because I know from our perspective, I mean, I would put us in the real life people, because we actually talk to governments constantly. Yeah. We're actually trying to negotiate. Right. And when we see the online people, we're like, sounds great, but like, I need to see something, something
exactly.
meaty,
it's
something substantial.
It's Jerry Maguire. Show me the money.
But it's been great, and it's been interesting to see that, because it's made me more sure of my own position. That's what it's helped.
Interesting. I share that. It's amazing to see the spectrum of people here in terms of their interests. I think I would take the whole thing a lot more seriously if they had a similar representativeness in terms of backgrounds. But that's kind of an aside. the physical people versus the tech people. So honestly, I sometimes suspect, and it's kind of an ugly suspicion, that the reason why the tech people want something like a network state or a special jurisdiction is because they tried to do something in the physical world and learned, much to their consternation, that it takes minimum 6 months to build a building, that it takes minimum 5 years to change a law, and they're simply very impatient. And they feel like it should be able to move faster, and that in some way they're entitled to be exempted from that process. And not to say that the concerns aren't valid. Like the criticism that things move too slow, I think is a very valid criticism. I mean, I love the idea that we need to go faster. It makes good sense to me. But also some things really do take time. And it's good to have, like, for instance, the project that I'm probably the most excited about right now that I'm not fully working on yet, because I can't talk about the projects that I am working on and I'm excited about, but I can tell you about the project that I'm not fully working on yet that I'm excited about, is the Silicon Zanzibar project. And this is an attempt to use an existing special economic zone in Zanzibar to create a new city. And the opportunity is huge there. The demographics are great. The economic growth is good. The institutional framework is good. But the real reason why I'm optimistic about it is because the guy who's pushing it is Daniel Yu. And what Daniel Yu does is he has an app that sells cooking oil to little roadside businesses. I mean, they're an online supplier of goods for the businesses that sell somebody a half a liter of cooking oil or a book of matches or a cup of beans. Toilet paper. Small, informal businesses use his app. So he understands what it is to have a warehouse with 500,000 liters of cooking oil in it. And he understands what it means to have a fleet of trucks and to send them out on roads that are bad. And he knows what it is to handle large amounts of cash from very poor people and make sure that pennies don't get lost. So that makes me feel optimistic about that project because he's a serious guy who's rooted in the real world. So he'll come at it from that angle.
Well, what you've just made me think of, and who knows, but what we're also talking about here is the divide between the real world and the metaverse.
The metaverse.
Right, but I suppose arguably someone's got to build the cities in the metaverse.
No one has to. No one has to. So this is important.
I have something very strong to say about that. That is like everyone is like, oh, we'll be in the metaverse all the time and so on and so forth. But what happens when someone cuts their power wire?
Yeah.
Like back to reality. I'm
yes.
sorry. So there's like, yeah, you can have all your community and so on, but at some point you gotta have to engage with what's around you.
I mean, here's my take on it, because we're already living in the metaverse. We've just got a little box we carry in our hand.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I'm almost certain a time will come when that gets integrated into, I have to say, other people's bodies. I'm not sure I'm going to be an old man.
You have to go talk to the longevity people.
Right. But, oh God, yeah. Yeah. Here's my problem with longevity as well. Like, I don't want to see my children become that old. I think that would be a very difficult thing to deal with. And I think if we start living longer, oh my God, we're going to have to deal with some very deep psychological problems.
It's terrible to me. Honestly, I was talking to one of the longevity people last night, and I was asking him, okay, so how long do you get? Right?
Good question.
What do you get if you do it?
Show me the money.
It was great, exactly. And his answer was great because it's so irrelevant, right? He said, 3 to 5% longer.
Oh, right.
And then I kind of thought, like,
at the moment, though.
At the moment, sure, but this is the moment.
Yeah, sure.
So, I'm 35. If I were going to do this thing, I'd do it in the next few years. So 3 to 5% doesn't sound like much, but I'd take it,
Yeah,
I probably would.
Which 3 to 5% though?
Exactly. Is it 3 to 5% longer in the home kind of thing?
Yeah, or in my 20s? Or 30s? Right. Like where do I get this extra bit of life?
Doesn't it kind of freak you out to see all these young people really, really worried about longevity? Like, to me, I think it's really bizarre. Like, personally, I'm not thrilled about aging, but like, I'm not obsessed with it.
Well, that depends, because I think I'm not sure we are acutely aware of how obsessed we are with longevity. There's a lot of people, myself included, that I could easily argue that it's the root of almost everything we do is this fear of death. It's just now, it's kind of like, okay, let's put it on the table.
That's like
Let's actually talk about it rather than
Freud, right? Like
Yeah.
the death wish and all that.
And to me, that what you were saying, it's like it depends on whether your idea is to expand your youth, meaning when your body is more capable, or expand your life, meaning each phase of life becomes longer. Because I think if you want to expand your youth, like I really understand that, because it's like, well, I look better, I don't have knee pain now, or I don't know what's gonna happen in 20 years. When you expand the whole life, I think that becomes a different setup, because then it's like, do you also expand the time of your life where you're also more dependable, right? So you need to depend more on other people to take care of you, and like how is that accounted in the equation?
Yeah, right, of course. I'm also skeptical about it because I don't see. Now we're talking about the thing that we don't know about.
Well, no, but I've never spoken to anyone really about it. So I
fair
did have a chat with a longevity person myself, but it got cut short. And I would want to. Well, I was thinking, God, do you want to come on the podcast and talk about this? But then, because I do want to know myself, I've not given it enough thought to have any particular stance on it. But talking about it, even with us not knowing too much about it, is going to help. So go ahead.
True. Well, I don't see these people living their lives in a way that's sustainable in the long term. So this idea of kind of moving around from one place to another, having kind of transient, non-geographic relationships, being rooted in communities that are primarily intangible, I think this makes a lot of sense at a certain stage in your life. But unless you're planning on forestalling later stages indefinitely, eventually it's going to become very unsatisfying. This is my suspicion from my own life. And so when I think about the question of longevity, I just wonder, are you living your life in a way where it's something that you will, in the end, be glad you prolonged? Or will you look at your life and say, I should have focused more on these things that have traditionally brought people happiness and satisfaction? That's what I wonder about from my own experience.
I think you're right that the digital nomadic life works much better when you're young and familyless, for sure. I've been through that whole thing myself. I as soon as I got kids, I didn't care about travel in the slightest. I mean, I've taken them traveling, but even that I've realized they're not getting as much out of it as I am. Yeah. I think they'll start getting it when they're in their later teens, maybe. But yeah, they want stability. They want to see the same curtains every morning when they open them and look out on the same view, and that's obvious to me. And I have noticed as well in the community I'm in that sometimes you find that the kids that travel around more are less well adjusted unless they have a very strong family unit, which is the antidote to this.
I agree.
If you can create a foundation of a family, then that's the constant rather than the place you're in. So I tend to agree. But then again, maybe these are the phases of life. These are the phases of life, and this is one section of the community coming up with a bunch of ideas, and they like I was saying earlier, they do coincide with political / personality types as well, and they also make sense when you're young. YOLO, take more risks, start new things, break things, all that. When you get older, you understand, all right, now someone needs to maintain this stuff. And I think probably in the creation of good cities, we need both of those people. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, so what I would like to add to both your arguments, it's like, I think we need to be a bit more agnostic on the situations. Like, there will be people who maybe will be nomadic their whole life, and that's what they want to do, and that's perfectly fine. But what we see, I think, in the overall population is that that's not the main trend, right? And then we need to accommodate for like what's going to happen with the rest, because that's going to be just, I know we hear like 200 people, like in a country that has way more than that. So that's kind of what I think about it.
Yeah, you're right. It is a small section of society. I suppose on the flip side, you could argue that the ability to be a digital nomad is a contemporary phenomenon. So we were only seeing the first generation or two that have actually been given the option, and they're definitely doing it. They're out there doing it,
True. That's true. I mean, it's a good observation, that when people are given this option, a non-trivial percentage of them go for it. Temporarily. We'll see how it plays out, but you're right. It's relatively new.
But that's the point. I mean, they're the pioneers in a way.
They are.
But they're also the pioneers of settlements as well, in a way, because it's almost like what we're seeing on the planet in the last sort of 50 years is a reorg, isn't it? We're seeing the internet has basically just acted like a plow through society, through information, through it's churning everything up, and it's giving people a chance to sort of like pick and choose what they want now. And I suppose we'll start seeing the balls drop and settle as of now and beyond. And
there's a novelty phenomenon where the behavior of the first generation exposed to something doesn't resemble the behavior of the people who come after them. So one of the reasons why we have such a problem in cities in the US is because we're living in infrastructure that was built by the first generation of people who were exposed to a high-income society, who had broad-based high incomes with cars and the ability to fly and the ability to build big suburban homes. And the way that they wanted to live doesn't reflect what you want if you grow up in that society. It reflects the way you want to live if you grew up in a poorer, more rural society and went through the transition. So this is part of the problem with having cities that don't evolve over time, actually, because you have this phenomenon where the first generation wants it one way, and then all the subsequent generations want something relatively different. I think we're going to see the same thing with this, where the people who are doing digital nomadism now, it didn't exist when they were born. They came to it, right? Or it came to them. The people who come after, where this is kind of continuously an option, are going to react very differently to the opportunity.
I like that the example of your Chinese intern who hates TikTok because his parents go home and spend the night looking at TikTok and he cannot engage with them.
Exactly.
And we think that's something that's so novel and it's so cool here, I guess. But there in China, because they've been exposed to it longer, and this kid has that impression of this technology.
Interesting. So what make some predictions about the future then? What's the future of governance and cities like, according to you guys? You've been involved in a new project. You've been involved in some legacy projects. So what's your kind of timeline, ideas for the future?
I'm going to answer the question I wish you'd asked.
Go on. No, absolutely.
Not that that's a bad question. Okay, first, it's important to differentiate rich cities that are growing slowly from poor cities that are growing fast. This is huge, totally different trajectories. Rich cities that are growing slowly have got their foot caught in a trap because of regulatory sclerosis. And what we're going to see in the next 20 years is most of them are going to get their foot out of that trap. They're going to unwind the rules that make it difficult to build housing. They're going to unwind the rules that make it difficult to do productive activities. And they're going to start adjusting away from the model that they've had, which, as I was saying, is like that first generation model, and towards something that more closely resembles how people want to live now. They're going to become more adaptive and flexible because local governments can do that. They have a track record of doing it. Poor cities that are growing very fast face a completely different matrix of challenges. The main challenge in poor cities that are growing very fast, which is most cities, by the way, to be clear, most cities, is simply making land available for development at the correct scale. So what we're going to see in the future is a bifurcation between cities that are actually able to respond to that challenge using simple plans like the ones that we talk about, where you lay out an arterial road network, preserve public open spaces, subdivide the land into lots, and let things happen. That's all those governments have the capacity to do. and cities that fail to do that and become surrounded by belts of informal settlements and slums that then will prove extremely costly to retrofit. So some of those cities are going to be much better at capturing the productive benefits of urbanization than others. That's going to be a bifurcation. And because urban prosperity translates into national prosperity, the countries that get it right are going to do much better on the global stage than the countries that get it wrong. And you can see this really clearly over the last 30 years in India versus China. So China got urbanization right. They put in place frameworks that allowed the creation of large amounts of low-income housing, not by the government, but by the private sector in urban villages. They invested in urban infrastructure and came up with ways to finance local governments, and they urbanized without any slum formation, no meaningful slum formation. India has centralized control over its cities, underinvests in infrastructure, has a regulatory stranglehold on development. It's not like people don't move to cities in that context. You just don't get the growth. You get some growth because there are still agglomeration economies, but you don't get China growth. You don't get 10x. So India's got themselves in a trap with that. China urbanized correctly. It's going to be the same thing in Africa, except 54 countries instead of 2.
And do you see India going down the path that you just mentioned, which would be to start pulling themselves out of that rut?
They've started investing in infrastructure. The regulatory stuff is harder, but there are some really good policy voices that are starting to have an influence on the government. But in India, the risk that they run is that good policy making gets obscured by their growing religious nationalism. So that's another possible fail mode for them. But fundamentally, the human capital that they have there is just insane. So, if they don't make it out, it'll be because of factors that aren't related to the quality of the people or entrepreneurship there.
Okay.
What I would say is what will not happen? Cities will not become obsolete. People will still be in cities. And that's a trend that's gonna keep going on. That's, to me, people are still gonna wanna be where most people are, and they're gonna wanna go to a store and buy clothes and buy a coffee and have a conversation with a friend in a bar. And I think that's still gonna happen now in 20 years and in 50 years if the world hasn't flooded yet.
Okay.
strong bet on the physical world.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I agree with that.
One thing that did one fly in the ointment on that thesis was the pandemic, for example. And I'll tell you why. Because I live in a very remote house out in the countryside. So that's our preferred way of living. And when the UK government started telling people they had to stay in their houses, there was an exodus like you could not imagine from cities of people either wanting to rent places in the countryside, just move into the countryside. Everyone wanted out because the quality of life became so much more unbearable. So I don't know. Is there anything to comment on that?
I have a comment in that, which is what happened in the pandemic is that the government restricted the options of people, right? Suddenly you had access to before then you had access to parks, you had access to all these services, and it was fun. When you don't have those options, then suddenly the only space that you have access to is your house, and therefore you want more space. So that's on one road. You want to have those options. And then on the other hand, after the pandemic, we have seen the average rent in many cities go up again after it went down.
A lot. It's higher than it was before the pandemic.
Manhattan last month reached again the highest record of average rent, for example. So,
but there is an inflationary pressure there, obviously.
Of course, there's an inflationary pressure.
Inflation's running at more than 10%.
But I think that the tendency is pretty clear. If it were true that being in cities no longer had value for people, that would be reflected in prices.
In home rent prices, because someone today was talking about offices and so on. The economy sectors are shifting, and the priorities of the space needs are different now that they were a few years ago, and they will be different in 10 years. But where people want to be based on, that trend's still there.
What's your take on 15-minute cities then?
Oh, for pity's sake.
That's a different conversation.
Well, for one thing, I feel bad for Carlos Moreno, who did nothing to deserve the vitriol that he's getting from the alt-right community these days. I don't know if you know about the guy who came up with the 15-minute city is a Colombian urbanist, Carlos Moreno, and he's been just getting terrible internet abuse because people are saying that the 15-minute city is a tool of the administrative state attempting to restrict people's freedom of movement. This is obviously nonsense. Look, the 15-minute city is like reaching in a hat and just pulling out a concept. People don't live in 15-minute cities. And the idea of restricting people's access to what's available within 15 minutes, or calling that kind of an ideal state, I think it ignores a lot of realities. So, for example, think of like, I don't know, does your wife work?
Well, she does now, but from home. She has.
Okay.
She
so
makes
you're a bad example.
Yeah.
No, so I'll take it again. So you can think of a couple where one person has a 15-minute commute and the other person has a 15-minute commute as well. And they live within 15 minutes of a grocery store and a barber shop and their child's school and a park and a playground, and they live in the 15-minute city. And then one of the partners gets a job offer to work at a university on the other side of town. Now, in the 15-minute city ideal, it's more important for them to keep their commute within a certain time span than it is for them to optimize for other things, like taking a job that has more opportunities. I find that to be a very simplistic way of understanding how people make decisions. Essentially what the 15-minute city is saying is that commuting time should be the thing that we optimize for. And it ignores the fact that people have other baskets of preferences.
And adding to that, like in a 15-minute city, your assumption is that you're going to be providing the basic services within that 15-minute city, right? So someone needs to come out with what those basic services are. Say every neighborhood needs to have a coffee shop and an old record store, right? But what happens if in that neighborhood nobody wants to buy old records? Like, do you still force that store to be there because that service is needed? Or does that guy want to go somewhere else because there's more demand in a different place of the city?
Yeah, it kind of ignores markets.
Exactly.
So not a dystopian super plan, just a really bad idea.
I would say what I like about the 15-minute city is it's forcing people to have conversations about why their neighborhoods don't have these things. And the answer to that is not that we failed to think that they need them. It's because they're not allowed to be there. So, the reason why my neighborhood in Brooklyn didn't have amenities that I wanted was partly due to markets, but partly due to zoning and regulations. I think that you'll get the things that the market can support within 15 minutes if you let it happen. Yeah. And then you'll kind of see where the gaps are. For example, providing childcare within 15 minutes of every residence. This doesn't necessarily strike me as a terrible idea. Providing some kind of access to medical care within 15 minutes of every residence, like simple medical care, that doesn't necessarily strike me as a terrible idea. But requiring private sector uses to be distributed in a certain way and saying kind of, it's wrong that you prefer the bakery across town. You should go to the bakery that's 15 minutes from your house. This just seems really simplistic. Also impossible, by the way. Impossible to actually do.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. It's funny, before we had a family, me and my partner lived in Berlin, and where they have very, very strict sort of, they did then regulations on putting rent up. And as a result, neighborhoods were vibrant, and if you worked in a coffee shop, we lived pretty much in the center of Berlin, but so did the person that waited in a coffee shop next door. It was nice, and it was unusual because I've seen London go the complete opposite way to having, and New York probably the same, having these voids of.
But there's an easier way to do that. There's an easier way to get there. So you can either control prices, which in most places isn't really a practical option for various reasons. It doesn't work when there's a high demand, right? Controlling prices doesn't work when there's a high demand because it means some people are left out in the cold. The other thing that you can do is you can deregulate space requirements. So in Paris, for example, rich people and poor people live in the same neighborhood because the smallest legal apartment size is 16 square meters. Right. So then a low-income person who wants to be in that location, like an artist, say, or someone who works at a coffee shop and hates commuting, can afford to live there next to the wealthy person, next to the middle-class person. You can do the same thing with commercial spaces, and we do in our plans. You make the ability to have very small commercial spaces so that the person who wants to try out opening an old record store can do so without making a huge capital commitment. And if it succeeds, they can do it in a space where their rents are relatively low, not because the rents overall are low, but because they're just not renting very many square meters.
I didn't even know that that was a regulatory thing.
It's completely a regulatory thing. Completely a regulatory thing.
So, I mean, take somewhere like India where, you know, you get shops that are literally 1 meter square.
Truly.
Right. They don't have it there. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, in India, they totally have it there. Those shops are illegal.
Right.
Yeah, they have all those rules there, of course. Now, the private sector messes this up as well. So if you go to a lot of new developments, you'll see that they are building these, you know, G+4, G+5, they're called.
Ground floor
Ground floor +4 or 5, very familiar looking apartment buildings. Generic, they usually occupy about an entire city block. And the commercial spaces that are there have a frontage of 20 meter frontage, something like that. So the only tenants who can afford to rent that space are big corporate tenants. And you end up with a very boring mix of services and no real opportunities for small entrepreneurs.
Fascinating. It's so true. I mean, that is the model, the worldwide model. This is why in every city you go to now, it looks roughly the same in the middle.
Exactly. So the way around that, which we're pushing, is instead of letting someone develop an entire block, let me put that another way. Instead of having the default be for someone to develop an entire block, you make the default a small frontage lot, say 5 meters, 6 meters. And that, we've actually seen it. They can be split into two. So, you have like a 3 meter frontage if you want it. And you're not regulating heights. So you can end up with something that looks more like a classic city where you have a number of small frontages that are available to entrepreneurs, and people can put apartments above the shops if they want, but you don't require that, but you make that the default by how you organize the land.
You basically reduce what the minimal unit that's available for purchase or for development is, so more people have access to that unit, and therefore there's more diversity of actors that can engage in the developing process.
The cool thing about this, and this is something also that's evolved in our thinking since we worked on the Morazán project, is the smaller you make that minimum lot, the more actors you have in that market, you can actually end up with a place that's more diverse, but has a higher price per square meter because you have more people competing for the space.
Yeah.
So you make more money.
Someone can come and rent 4 units. And
Surely.
Still,
if you want to.
Exactly.
It doesn't make sense to do it the other way unless, like you say, the free market or the market, let's say, has gone, well, we need these corporations to move in because we know how much they're going to pay.
Yeah, there's a stability element to it, but also I think a real lack of creativity. And that's why I think we've introduced these ideas, but we've really reintroduced old ideas. People are snapping it up. I mean, the demand for this kind of planning is very high because I think people know that the way that they're doing it now, working with a limited number of actors and doing very generic designs, isn't producing the kinds of cities that people actually want.
Yeah, and I think what we feel is we're not inventing anything here, right? These are all things that we walked around the world here and there and observe, and they are very doable and they work in many places. We're just trying to reintroduce them in a packaged way to new places because that's very different from what the current norm is.
Yeah. I'll wrap this up soon, but this is such an interesting conversation. I'm sorry I keep asking so many questions.
No worries.
Something when I visited Próspera, and I was talking to some of the guys there, they mentioned that they had talks or they'd been discussing the notion of selling 3-dimensional space. What do you think about this? And here's why I thought it was interesting. You build an apartment near the sea, you value your view. Now it can have a price on it. How much are you prepared to pay for this? So how much are you prepared to buy the 3-dimensional space in front of your house going down to the sea? Do you think that's a good idea or a bad idea?
That exists already in New York and Manhattan.
Does it?
That's called FAR, which is floor area ratio, and they calculate the volume. And some buildings were like, okay, I have a restriction to build, and Patrick, correct me if I'm saying this wrong, but I have a restriction to build to 5 stories. I'm buying the stories that my neighbor won't build. That's why you have some disparities.
But can you buy and sell the space?
Yes.
You can.
That's exactly what you're buying and selling.
Right.
Yeah, it's air rights. So you surely can buy that. Introducing it there, I can't see any reason why not. I mean, in principle, I'm against air rights. I think we probably both are. Because the only way that you can have a market for air rights is if you're restricting the amount of construction that you're allowing. So there's no market for air rights unless there's a scarcity. But the example that you bring up of people wanting to buy air rights to preserve a view,
I think
I don't see any harm in
what you
that.
could do on that, it's like, okay, there's 2 lots between me and the view of the sea, or 3 or whatever. So I'll buy those lots and then resell them with a clause that says you can only build up to 2 stories because above that I won't see anything. And you can do it in like a micro market in a way, because that's your interest. I wouldn't necessarily say, okay, now everyone can do that, but like if you want those rights, buy that lot and restrict what you can do there. Don't have the city restrictive for you because you don't want to lose that view.
Wouldn't it? Wouldn't it be more simple to just create 3-dimensional rights, because then you can buy and sell it, and there is an actual value on it. If you can, like it's the view has a tangible value.
You get 3-dimensional rights anyway. I mean, if you buy a lot, you're getting 3-dimensional rights.
So does that mean I can't build? I mean, I think in Próspera there is a maximum height, isn't there?
I would guess. I don't know.
But they have built a 13-story building there. So
sure.
Presumably, you could just build a 13-story building right in front of someone's house.
But here's the thing. I think there's a hitch in it, which is that you're not going to be able... The person who has that view and they want to build a 13-story building there, they're not going to be able to outbid the person who wants to put a 13-story building there.
They might.
They might, but in that case,
or they might buy it with the property originally, and then they have a valuable thing. Then the market will find just how much that view's worth.
Sure. Yeah, but I guess I don't see why it's different from just buying the lot. Because again, when you buy a lot, you're buying
more expensive, probably. I would have thought.
Well, possibly
buying the lot would be quite pricey, but buying the 5th story above at a lot might be quite cheap, because who's going to build,
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it
disagree
seems...
with that, because in the end, like, the way that you, like, that air right is not valuable if you don't have the lot, in a way. No,
because you can't actually use it, so if you don't control the ground...
So
yeah, but it doesn't matter. All you're doing is maintaining your view, aren't you?
Let me reframe it. So what you're doing is... stopping someone from developing those 5 stories. Yes. So therefore, the price of that air is in market with what the benefit would be for the other guy to develop those 5 stories. So even if you don't own the 2 bottom stories, the price that you're competing with, it's still equivalent.
That's true. Yeah, no, that's true. So to me, in that situation, if someone actually had the money to buy those rights, I would think that they would just themselves build that building and move into it.
Could be.
No,
maybe they love the house.
They love their house. Well, I mean, I'm not against it. Putting a market on these things is better than the way that it typically works, where, as you were saying, like where someone goes and complains to the municipality and it's just a dead weight loss.
But one of the things I liked about Próspera was the platform of Próspera, which made a lot of things easy. And I was just thinking that would stop disputes in a moment, because all you would have to do is go into the market and see, well, I can't afford that view, or I can't afford to build a 5-story building.
That's
because,
interesting.
It's for sale, basically, potentially.
That's interesting.
There's a price. I mean, there's a price for everything, isn't there?
But I think the problem, one problem that I could see with that is if someone buys those rights at a particular moment in the development trajectory, they would pay a fair price for it at that particular moment. But that might not reflect the long-term cost of preventing development there. So you may still be generating some loss if you had someone who wanted to, like, say they love their house and they wanted to keep their view forever.
Well, I mean, but as an early investor, I suppose the risks are higher in a free city anyway, in a new city.
Yeah.
So there's a premium on being one of the first people there.
Yeah,
True.
And to me, it's a valid thing. I think you see that a lot in like developments on the coast, where someone was there first and was able to get like a big single family home in the first line of the beach, and right next door they have a big building because whoever was next to them sold their land because it was more beneficial for them to have the money, and someone developed a bigger building there, but the other person prefers to have their house in front of the beach, and therefore they keep it. And that's how you get the diversity and the different offer for people. Like, I want to have like a full house for myself, and the other ones are happy to be able to rent an apartment next to the beach, and everyone is okay.
Now, the way that we've screwed this up in the States is now we say, I own the house, you own the apartment building, you know. Now we say that the person who owns the house can actually block the apartment building next door from being built because of its impact on their value. And I think that that's a misunderstanding of property rights. So to me, when you own a property, you have the asset, and then you have the potential increase in value in the asset, and then you have the risk that the value of the asset will go down. And if someone builds something next to you that they're allowed to build, and it causes the value of your property to go down, that risk was embedded in the price that you already paid, right? You agreed to take that risk when you took it on.
It's managing expectations, though, isn't it?
It's managing expectations.
People expect
constant price increases,
but which is why I think if you did sell three-dimensional space, you're already the market. You're pricing it in right from the start in a way, and the expectation is, if I want to do this, there's a market for it. There's no having to knock on next door and say, do you mind not doing this? And then they're going to the courts and having a dispute. And there's just a platform, and it's like a yes or no. I can afford it. I cannot afford it.
It makes sense. I mean, it makes sense to me. I have to think about it more, but the idea of someone locking in their view or the conditions around their property, I think you'd have to pay the same price. Like the market price for that would be the same as if you were buying the lot in front of you for development. So it would be expensive, but you could do it.
Yeah. I mean, there's people who buy the whole island because they want an island for themselves and have their own mansions. Like, sure, do it.
Yeah. True.
That's fine.
Well, look, this has been a fascinating conversation. I'd go on longer, but we're actually about to run into the next interview. I didn't think we were going to take 2 hours.
Oh, heavens.
But I do have one final question we ask on the pod. If you had the chance to have a sabbatical of 1 year paid for, so you can take off, or you can stay, you can carry on doing what you're doing, it doesn't matter. Point is, you've got money from a patron. What would you spend that time on? 1 year?
So right now I'm pregnant. I'm about to expect a baby. So I think that would be an amazing year for me to get a paycheck and not have to work and be able to spend the time getting to know my baby.
Brilliant. All right. That was a very simple answer. Patrick, what about you?
I think my answer is equally unsatisfying because I'm totally happy with what I do now, and I feel completely connected to it as having a sense of purpose and an impact. So I think what I would probably do is just keep doing what I'm doing, bank that money.
Sign less on the weekends.
Maybe work a little less on the weekend. Yeah, that's what I'd do. I don't have any itches right now.
Well, that's a good sign in my book. I think that's a signal you're doing what you should be doing. So congratulations, and thanks for talking. Like I say, I love people who have real life experience of doing stuff. I don't necessarily like the hypothetical conversations as much as I do like actually speaking to experts who actually do it. So thanks for that. I really enjoyed this conversation, and hopefully see you another place, another time, and we'll do it all again.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
It's been our pleasure.
Yes.